Pardon the interruption. I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, how are you surviving Minnesota's wettest June?
Just make it stop. Please, just make it stop. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, this is the first webisode once the course has really gotten up and running. When we looked at the first discussion board post, we talked a lot about online education and people's experiences with that. I think that was really informative. What were any observations you had looking at that?
Well, first, just thanks to the students for being so forthcoming, not just with that part of the post, but also their introductions. It was really fascinating to read where everyone is this summer, why they're taking the course. It was interesting to see the mix of experience people had. For some, this is the first online experience they've had. For others, they're taking two other online courses at the same time, which I think by itself is really interesting.
Yeah, I think doing just multiple courses at the same time seemed difficult. Doing multiple online courses, that just seems like it'd be really difficult.
And I think the fact that people do anticipate it being somewhat difficult, whether it's because they're not used to the online environment or just that they're doing a lot of work or that they've got actual paid work on the side, I think underscores. A lot of people talk about the need not to procrastinate, and I would affirm that strongly. It's one reason we actually do daily assignments for the most part, except for right before or right after the test. You pretty much always have some work, whether it's a reflection or a discussion post or a worksheet going with museum, and it's not meant to be busy work, I think was one concern someone had. This is all meant to prepare you for the test, to give you a chance to reflect, to apply historical knowledge to the present day, but also it means that you get into a rhythm and a pattern.
Right, and I think there's going to be, as you start to go through the films and are going through the films, you've already noticed there's a lot of information there, so part of what we're trying to do with those is to give you some structure. So we'll talk a little bit later about the study guide, things like that, but that's meant to give some structure to this as you're working through these films and doing that.
And I think we say this in the face-to-face course for students who are worried about time management. Kind of set aside a certain time. This is going to be your time in a certain place where you're going to sit down, watch the movie, go through the museum, do your work, and just get into that rhythm. And I think you'll find it kind of works out. Another comment, one of my students, I think Carolina was her name, said that she's planning to work ahead a little bit. And I think to a certain extent we want to enable that. We'll always have a day or two in advance if you wanted to, maybe you're going to be working, maybe you're going on vacation. And actually, if you know that you're going to be gone for a couple of days, you might want to let us know and we can maybe do a little bit more. I think, do that as you know that you're able to do it. I think for most people that's probably not a great strategy because just keeping up will be the challenge. But if you can do that, go ahead and we've got the stuff ready to go. We'll make it available to you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to think about if you're going to be away from a really solid internet connection is when you're doing the museums. I did make them available to download as well to both Mac and PC. It's really smart to do that if you don't know about the connection in the place that you're going, because I think to stream those unless you have a strong connection is not great. They're pretty big files, but you can have it download overnight. You wake up in the morning and it's there, so I'd recommend doing that. Another thing in terms of thinking about time management in this course is realizing that although a film may be 31 minutes long or 40 minutes long, know that the process of working through that film is longer than 30 minutes or 40 minutes because you're going to want to maybe pause, you're going to want to be writing things down, taking notes. So it's going to be more than just turning this on and sitting and watching it, but you're going to need to be taking things in, and that might mean taking your time working through them.
Yeah, take advantage of that. I did a kind of hybrid course once where I replaced some lectures with hour-long podcasts. And I thought, well, that'd be interesting to see what they do with that format. And I asked, and almost everyone just listened straight through as if it were a lecture. And this is a chance to actually play with that a little bit. Stop it, listen to it, and watch it in 10-minute chunks. Or a lot of these interact with a specific reading. And so maybe we kind of preview the reading, pause the film, go do the reading, then maybe go back and listen to the comments again, and it'll probably set you up for the reflection assignment. A couple of technical things. They're in the syllabus. We've mentioned them, but just to underscore. First of all, you can use iOS pad devices, Androids, other kind of things for the films. You can use it for the webisodes. We do the museums in Flash, as I understand it. And so if you've got an Apple mobile device, it's not going to work on that. But we do, in the syllabus, there's a link to alternatives if you want to do that, or you can download.
And I'm working on it, so maybe by the end of the last couple museums, you will be able to do on iOS devices.
Right. The other thing is, if you do have an issue, just as a first step, always try quitting the browser, restarting it, switching to a different browser, or even restarting your computer. That I mean, I think our experience last year is 95% of the time that took care of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
If there is a problem, talk to Sam, talk to IT, and they can probably fix it pretty quickly.
Yep. And there's always.
Okay, so Sam, this is our second webisode. The first one was partly just to introduce us, set up the course. Now that we're into our kind of regular run of webisodes, what should students expect from them? What purpose do they serve?
Well, I think the big thing that we're going to do here is really two pieces. One of them is that we're going to be reviewing content. So, we've been looking at the ancient world. So, once we're done with this part of the discussion, we're going to start to dive into kind of some of the content we've looked at, some of the people we've talked about, some of the readings we've done, and give you a chance to experience that information in a little bit different way as well, us talking about it. And then the other thing we're going to be doing is taking this discussion that we're having both in the films and the museums, but also in the webisodes, and pushing them back out to the discussion board. So one of the things that you're going to be doing coming out of this webisode is going back to the discussion boards and starting to kind of work on some questions that we have.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that at the end of this segment. About half the webisodes will end that way, so you should expect one discussion post each unit from here on out. The webisode that comes right before the test will be purely review, so especially whatever the most recent film or museum. But we also will talk a little bit about preparing for the test. Would be another function of the webisode.
As we're starting to, look ahead to the course, looking at the exam, things like that, I think it's worth talking a little bit about how to prepare for the exams. What should you be doing while you're looking through the museums, while you're watching the films? What are some sort of pieces of advice we can give with your eye on the exam, which I think is July 9th?
July 9th. So the first exam is actually a little ways off. The way it works is it actually compresses as you go along. So the first unit is by far the longest, the second's a little shorter, and the third is really short. So the space between the second and third exams isn't very long. So it's this first one's a little ways off. This first week, just get accustomed to whatever your rhythm of doing the work is going to be, how the museums work, how the films work. But I guess I just encourage you to keep that first unit study guide open alongside whatever the daily assignment is, because a lot of what you're doing in museums is not just answering those 5 questions, but you're mastering vocab especially. And so we talk about this in the study guide, that some of your vocab is just stuff you need to recognize, where it fits in a timeline. If you see a description of it, you can say, oh, that's Aristotle. Actually, that's a pretty big one. Oh, that's Pericles or something. That might be a big one too. But some of them, though, the one we shade and we highlight as mastery terms, things that we expect you to be able to tell us why they're significant, tell us how they connect to each other, use them in essay questions. And you should expect to see those. We'll often ask about them as part of a worksheet, especially to sort of point you in that direction. But just remember, you don't have lectures in this course. You might use the textbook to supplement it, but those films, the museums, and the reading packet to some extent, that's where you're going to get the information you need. I mean, I think what's challenging for students, whether it's face-to-face or online CWC, is the difference between describing something, putting it on a timeline, and actually being able to explain to us why it's significant. So how do you explain that?
What I always tell students is, sometimes it's really obvious, like, they've talked a lot about this in the film or the museum, or Backman talks a lot about this person, and significance sometimes is really clear. But if you find yourself struggling to say, why is this person, or why is this event, or why is this thing significant, there's usually 3 questions you can ask yourself to help you start to get at that. The first question is, why was this person, event, or thing important in its own time? Right? How did it affect the world that it existed in? Secondly, how is it important to us today? Did it somehow shape some aspect of the world that we currently live in? And the third thing, since this course is Christianity and Western culture, it's sometimes worth asking, what does this thing have to do with Christianity? Because some terms, for example, something like Alexander the Great, he predates Christ by 350 years, but he actually has a significant role to play in the story of Christianity because of Hellenization, right? Because of the spread of Greek culture, which helps set the stage for the world into which Christ is born. So that's one where you could say, okay, he's important because he conquered a lot of lands and things like that. But when we're really getting to why he's important, part of it actually has to do with this broader narrative about Christian history that we're going to be talking about. So if you look at those 3 questions, that can help you get at it. You're not going to be able to answer all 3 for every term, but that's a pretty good guide if you're feeling stuck on significance. Another thing that we're going to be asking you to do on the exam is not just thinking about these terms in isolation, but thinking about terms in relation to each other as well. So, one way that in the face-to-face course we often have the TAs talk with students about is the idea of thinking about all these terms as interconnected terms, right? You can connect them historically on a timeline, but you can also connect them sort of in a web, right? A web of information. How do things connect, and how do they fit together? So you could say something like, we could start with a term like Athenian democracy, right? And we could say, okay, well, what terms could we attach to that? Well, we could attach Pericles to that. And to Pericles, we could attach Thucydides because he writes about Pericles and the significance of Pericles, things like that. Other things we could attach to Athenian democracy. Socrates, right? He's living in the Athenian democracy. He's put on trial by the democracy of Athens. We could connect then to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We can start to build a web of interconnections. And the key thing is not just that they connect, but thinking about this term and the connection. What is that connection? And if you can describe what that connection is, you've gone a long way to succeeding in this course and to really becoming a good historian.
Did you just animate the web that you drew as like a telestrator?
I should do that.
That'd be great. Two pretty easy people to connect are Plato and Aristotle, since Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And even though they're in some ways similar to each other as foundational philosophers, they're very different on some ideas. And my sense, having done this for a long time, is these are two of the hardest nuts to crack for a lot of students. I mean, philosophy is a fairly new discipline for most students taking the course, and their ideas are not simple. I mean, in some ways they're very straightforward, but the ramifications are hard. So Sam, what is maybe one of the hardest things to master about Plato and or Aristotle in your experience teaching this course?
I think one of the hardest and most important things, and in terms of thinking about this as a tough nut to crack, part of it is also a very worthwhile nut to crack, because once you understand this, you're going to realize that Plato and Aristotle are these just titans in Western thought, and their ideas keep coming up.
And in Christianity in many ways.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, Plato's going to have huge effects on people like Augustine. Aristotle's going to have huge effects on people like Aquinas. These are folks we're going to meet later in the course. So I think that the way to get at Plato and Aristotle, I think that's helpful, is to think about how they think about truth, right? So Plato's teacher was Socrates, and the big thing with Socrates is that he really believed that universal truths exist, right? That's one of the things he argues with the sophists about, right? Saying there are universals. Then he starts to ask all these questions to try to get at them. So when I think about Plato and Aristotle, I think about what they're doing is really continuing that project that Socrates started. They're saying, okay, yes, universals exist. Where are they? How do we know them? Right? And Plato's going to say that they exist in this sort of unfettered realm of ideas which exist outside of the physical world. That's kind of hard to wrap our heads around, but I think the way to think about it is, if Plato's going to start an exploration of a question, right? He's going to start with the idea of sort of what is the big notion, what is the big idea. So a famous book that Plato writes is The Republic, right? His goal in The Republic, among a lot of other things, is to talk about what does the best form of human society look like? What does the best state look like? What does the good state look like? That'd be how Plato would talk about it, right? And if Plato's going to start a question of what does a good state look like, he's going to start with the idea of goodness and say, if we want to know what a good state is, first we need to think about what is goodness. What is that idea? So you start with that idea, and then you kind of work towards the generalities, right? You work towards, well, if we think about what goodness is, that'll help us understand what a good person is. If we know what a good person is, that'll help us know what a good society is, right? So he's going to work out in that direction. Aristotle, Plato's student, takes that same project of saying, where do universals exist? How do we know them? And he's going to turn it on its head. He's going to look at Plato's sort of idea of the forms, right? These ideas which exist outside of the physical world. And he's going to say, yeah, this idea of form as universal is a great notion. That works. But what he's going to do is say, form isn't this thing that exists outside of this world. It exists within the world itself, right? So if he wants to know about a good state, he's going to take an entirely different approach. He's not going to say, let's sort of sit around and think about what goodness is. That doesn't make sense to Aristotle. He's going to say, if we want to know the form of a good state, what we should do is we should start to look at governments, states in this world. Because he says the form of the good state exists within states. And if we can explore enough states, we can start to uncover those. And Aristotle also writes a book, like Plato did, to say what is a good state. He writes a book called The Politics. But his methodology, because of how he thinks about truth, his methodology is to say, instead of thinking about what is goodness, he says, I'm going to travel around Greece. I'm going to travel to all these different city-states. I'm going to study how they do politics. And by looking at all the generalities, I'm going to build towards an idea of what a good state looks like, right? So they have the same project, what is a good state, but they come at it in different directions. And they use that approach for everything that they talk about, right? So I think if you understand this idea of Plato wants to start with the big ideas, right? That's where we find truth outside of the physical world. And what that ends up meaning is that he doesn't trust the physical world very much, doesn't put a lot of weight in the physical world. Aristotle's going to say we start in the physical world, and therefore Aristotle's going to put more focus on the physical, right? And we'll see those ideas play out again and again.
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways you can understand then why Plato is so attractive to early Christians and later Christians, is he's pointing at something beyond this world. It sometimes can be harder for students to understand why Aristotle is so attractive. And there I point you towards the read on ethics that we give you, where Aristotle asks, what is the good life? What is the purpose for an individual? And he'll point towards virtue, which I think is really helpful. I think about this a lot in terms of what the educational project, what are we doing in a place like Bethel? In some ways, we're making you the people you're meant to be, and we're trying to cultivate virtues, like truthfulness would be one of them. You care about whether something is true or false. A sense of modesty or humility might be one. Some of the values are on my shirt, or the virtues we try to inculcate. And so how do you do that? And here's where it gets kind of controversial, because I think Christians generally could affirm the sense of we're being formed into something in the image of God. How do you do that? Aristotle says that you start as this kind of blank slate. You're not born with natural virtue or natural vice, which becomes a problem with, say, Augustine's idea of original sin. And so you've got to say, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to practice that and do it enough that it becomes habit, and then it just becomes part of my character. These kind of unconscious reflexes that in a situation you will act with humility or moderation or prudence or wisdom or courage. And so I think that's a really interesting and I think really directly applicable notion. This is something we all should think about. In what ways are there parts of ourselves that we need to work on, but also to ask, how much of this can we actually do on our own? How much can we make ourselves into the people we're meant to be? How much has to come from outside of us?
And like I said, I think the parallels in Christianity, in the history of Christianity, are pretty obvious in terms of, do you look at people who focus on Christian practice, right? Mm-hmm. In the best possible sense, thinking about Christian, like rite and ritual and those kind of things, and deeds, the good work that we do. And we're going to look at lots of people who focus on less on theology and more on how do we live our lives, right. And that's the thing that matters. And others are going to focus on understanding those big ideas, and that sort of shapes who we are and how we live in this world. Last thing for this segment, we had that this was going to push out to a discussion, so we want to pick up one of the big themes that we've been looking at in this sort of the first part of this unit. Chris, what is our discussion post theme going to be for this
yeah,
week?
I'm really excited to hear this, because I think this should be about this or encounter this in some way, and that's essentially, what is justice? That'd be another classic question for philosophers from Socrates on down, and where do we find it? Plato and Aristotle have different ways of doing it. You've also heard this in at least 3 of the readings you've encountered. So, in some ways, our first film starts with Martin Luther King Jr.'s response to what is justice, or at least what's a just law versus an unjust law. And he talks about this really early in the letter from Birmingham jail. But more recently, you've heard this from Greece. In Sophocles' play Antigone is essentially this hour-and-a-half long meditation on what is justice. Antigone suggests that it's something that's eternal, it comes from the gods, and she means that differently than a Christian would, but again, you can see how Christians might resonate with that. Creon, though, attaches it to, and stability and security and a sense of order, and that's actually a strong impulse within Western culture as well, and the play is just them arguing out male-female relationships and parent-child relationships, and so that's an important discussion there. The place that sometimes you can overlook is Thucydides addresses this in one of the 2 excerpts we give you from his History of the Peloponnesian War, where he tells the story of the Athenian ambassadors who go to this tiny island and try to force the Melians into joining their empire. You're acting unjustly, and the Athenians have this very ruthlessly pragmatic response.
Well, and especially when you read that, think about the part you read before, where Pericles is sort of talking about the virtues of the Athenian democracy.
For Greece,
try to, because that's what Greece was trying to do, right? They have ideals, and then they have the reality of their actions, and it's not hard to think about the modern world and think about the United States, and we have ideals and we have actions, and how do we live not only as integrated people, but as an integrated society where our values and ideals and our actions line up.
Yeah. So you can expect the discussion on what is the nature of justice and where do you see tensions? Is there a certain reading that spoke to you, a certain perspective that resonates with your own ideas? So that discussion post will be available on Moodle. So after the webisode, you can go over there and share, again, a good paragraph or two. You can start a thread, you can respond to someone else's. We just want to see that you're taking the question seriously, you're responding to what you've heard in readings, you're seeing in films, and that'll be due by tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. For all these assignments, we want you to have it done by 10, keep on task. If it's late for some reason, you can get partial credit, but you've got to get it done that day. After like 11:59 p.m. Central Daylight Time, it goes away. You can't catch up on stuff days later. Don't come to us asking, can I have an extension on something? Because, again, it's so important that you just keep up with this daily task, because otherwise you're going to dig yourself a online course, especially as set up. So understand, if you want to check the late policy in the syllabus, you'll find it there. But get it done before 10 o'clock, and there's no problem.
Welcome to segment 2 of the webisode. What we're going to do today is we're going to play a little game, a little ranking game. We're going to rank the great figures of the ancient world. So each of us have our sort of food chain of the great figures of the ancient world. And we're going to start with Amy. She's going to post hers. I'm going to post mine, and we'll have a little debate here.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So in my number 1 position here, I have Plato. In number 2, I am going to put Aristotle. In number 3, I am going to put Alexander the Great. Coming in at 4th, my personal favorite, I am going to put Thucydides. And then for my final slot, I am going to choose Pericles. So now I can go, So I have Plato here in position number 1, and it's sort of alluding to many of the comments that you've already heard about from Chris and Sam in our first segment of the webisode. But Plato's influence, we often will use the phrase in CWC, although you haven't heard us say it yet, but some of the other professors, particularly the philosophers that work on our team during the semester, will always say sort of the rest of philosophy is simply a footnote to Plato, that everything goes back to Plato. And one of the things that I really like about Plato that Sam highlighted in his earlier comments was how much Plato has to say in a modern context. And I was even just listening to a podcast yesterday about near-death experiences and 2 physicists sort of debating the possibility of near-death experiences. And it was fascinating to me how often Plato came up in their conversations as a way to sort of talk about the impact that Plato has on the field of science and in particular in physics. So I have Plato right there. I put Aristotle into the 2nd position here because of how Aristotle, sort of, if we want to think of this as sort of lesson introduced, Plato's ideas, and then Aristotle here in the idea of sort of lesson extended, taking some of the work of Plato as his student, but then saying, here's how I think about this differently. We're still trying to answer the same questions, and I'm not rejecting all of the ideas that you bring up, but here's how I think about it, and here's how I'm going to kind of build at it to try to arrive at it in a different way. Then we have Alexander the Great, who, as we also mentioned, yes, Alexander is known for his conquests, for his expansion of the Greek Empire. And I sort of think of that as this idea of saying lesson learned and then lesson applied. How do some of these influences actually work out in society, and then taking some of those advances that come as a result and then moving them out into the known world and in sort of a incredibly successful type of way. And that idea too that we have in CWC of how does everything build on what came before it, and Alexander's role in sort of shaping and creating a world that Christianity is going to be born into. And that to really understand the culture into which Christianity emerges, we have to go back to Hellenization and Alexander. My personal favorite, though, here is Thucydides, our ancient Greek historian. One of the reasons that I like Thucydides is that I teach a class on environmental history, and I absolutely love environmental history as a discipline. It's a relatively new discipline within history, but Thucydides plays a really important role as sort of being the first environmental historian. When we look back at a lot of primary source documents, mostly historians are writing about people, and they're writing about what people said and what people did, and they're writing about battles and outcomes. Thucydides, though, has a writing called The Plague at Athens, where he documents this mysterious plague that's going to hit the Athenians, and it's going to wipe out about a third of the population. But what's so fascinating about the writing is that he's not only writing about the impact of the plague, but he is actually listing out the symptoms. And his intention in doing that was so that if all of the population was wiped out, centuries later, if someone was to stumble upon his writing, they would know what the symptoms were so that they could be on the lookout for it and sort of know how it was going to progress. And how they could take care of it and be on the lookout for it. So it's one of the very first writings, and that actually only happens again a very few times in the next several centuries, where we have historians documenting what's actually sort of happening in the environment to sort of act as a warning to societies that are going to hopefully survive and emerge later. And then in my final slot here, I put Pericles because of his role and influence in the development of Athenian democracy. I actually like all of these guys because, again, as an environmental historian, I'm not the first one to do this, but something environmental history has taught me is the impact of geography on societal development. And so in ancient Greece, we see the impact of all of these people living and thriving in a place where it's a healthy climate, there's plenty of good agriculture, they can be out in the sunshine, and that's why we have Plato has time to do all his great thinking and sit around and talk about his ideas and isn't busy just trying to get food all day. Take it away, Sam.
Well, your list is actually really good. I'm a fan of it. Now, a couple criticisms that I will make. Basically, almost everyone you have listed here lives within about 80 years. The ancient world's bigger than that. So
what?
So I mean, there's a couple things that, as I put my list together, that I thought a little bit differently about. Looking at my board, at the first spot, I wanted to disagree with you, but you kind of have to go with Plato in the number one spot. I mean, he's going to be your first person off the board. A big theme that I think about, and I think this is really true for what you have here, is there's this idea that although the Athenian democracy is relatively short-lived when we think about sort of the big span of history, and we compare it to something like the Roman Empire. Roman Empire lasts for 500 years, but what the Greeks do is they create an empire of the mind, right? And that lasts far beyond Athens being this independent democracy, and Plato is just too big of a figure not to have there. I agree with everything you said. He's got to be number one on your board, right? Sitting at number two, I have someone who didn't even make your board, someone much earlier, and this is the Greek poet Homer. And here's what my thought here. Plato fundamentally shapes philosophy in the Western world, is so important to Western education, but so is Homer. Not to philosophy, but to Western education. I mean, if you look at pretty much any time in history before the last 200 years, Homer is going to be an essential piece of the curriculum that people in the West are going to be reading. He taught the Greeks about, or illustrated the Greeks about virtue. Talked not only about their gods, but also about sort of what does it mean to be a good Greek, their virtue, their values. And I would say if you've never read any Homer, as a 21st century person, you could look at Homer and say, this is almost 3,000 years old. What's going to be valuable here? Read the Iliad. It's the best war story that's ever been written. I mean, I love watching war movies, Vietnam War movies. I had a stint in my life where that was the thing I was really interested in. And then I read the Iliad and realized, oh, it's already been written. This is one of the greatest stories ever told. And it's not just a war story in terms of thinking about, cool battles and stuff like that, because I'm not super interested in that, but about thinking about the ethics of war. How do we approach war? How do we approach grace in war, right? How do we approach personal affronts in war? It's an unbelievably modern read for something that's 3,000 years old. I think Homer's got to be on this board. Number three, I'm going to move out of Greece and put Caesar Augustus. He is the first Roman emperor, right? He brings stability to the Roman Republic, moves it into the empire, around the time of the birth of Christ. The Roman Empire is too big to ignore as we're thinking about the ancient world. So I think you have to have Caesar Augustus on there. Next, I'm going to put Socrates. The teacher of Plato, he really sets the stage for the work that Plato does. Now, I thought about putting Socrates number one, because if you do this empire of the mind thing, why wouldn't you put the person who originated it? But Plato's sort of like the Empire Strikes Back, right? It's better than Star Wars. It's better than I don't call it A New Hope. It's better than the original Star Wars, right? So Plato's like our empire. Here's our episode 4, right? And then number 5, I also put Aristotle. If I'm thinking about education, Plato is going to be the sort of the father of what we often tend to think of as philosophy, with Plato and Socrates. Aristotle is going to introduce a more scientific approach to how we think about truth. So I think that you need to have Aristotle on this list. I actually didn't have him on this list, and as you were talking, I pulled off Alexander the Great and said I have to have Aristotle on my list.
Wow.
Thoughts?
Okay. Wow. No, I mean, I think that this is great. I think that your comments on Homer completely make sense. So as I'm sitting here, I feel like, oh no, this is a better list. I agree what you have to say here about Caesar Augustus. On the other hand, I feel like you just kind of threw him in because you felt like you had to. But I like your argument that we needed to sort of make this broader than focusing so specifically on the ancient world. So I would, if I could make adjustments to my list, I'm probably going to throw out Pericles, and I probably would bring Caesar Augustus over here to my side. I'm going to let you stick with Homer simply because I know how much Homer personally means to you, and I kind of like to slam Homer a little bit in a sick way, like I like to sort of slam the Beatles and Bob Dylan just because I know how much they mean to you.
And Shakespeare.
And Shakespeare.
And I will say that the person that I pulled off the list to add Aristotle was Alexander the Great, because I really struggled with, I feel like I needed to have one of these two.
Yes.
But if I only have 5, I can't have them both. So I was trying to think about what is more significant, the Greek Empire of the mind, which I feel like is represented by these people, or the Roman Empire. So I feel like what Alexander the Great does is spread the work that these people did. So I'd rather have the thing that really shapes what that empire is than the person who sort of sets the cultural stage for
True,
spreading.
except I sort of like the idea that anybody can sit around and come up with ideas. It's people who can put them into action, right? There's people who...
That's a pretty fair argument.
Yeah, so...
What we need is someone to come in and just sort of serve as judge.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Well, you're filming a webisode right here. You have a couple of food chains. Let's see what's going on. I like both of these a lot, by the way. Sam, I agree. The Iliad is one of the great war stories. I had this idea I'm going to teach a P course about war at some point. That would be the first book, or Sun Tzu or something. We'd start there. Amy, as the chair of the history department, I can't tell you how proud I am that you've managed to put the cities in the top 4. So the only way I can break this tie is to point out 2 numbers. I think they'll fit on here, which is that you have 2 philosophers and Sam has 3. And just to annoy our philosophy colleagues who are no doubt watching, I'm going to give it to Amy. She only put 2 philosophers on, because 3 out of 5 philosophers?
Right.
Happen.
This is a very special day.
Good job.
Thank you very
Welcome back to the webisode. I'm back in the chair with Amy. Well played,
everyone.
By the way. That was
Yes.
very nicely done for your first
Thank
attempt.
you.
Okay, it's happy time here on the webisode. Start with happy birthday to actress Monica Potter, 43 today. Amy, Monica Potter stars on TV's Parenthood.
She does.
Recently renewed for its 6th and final season, I
Yes.
understand. How does Parenthood stack up compared to creator Jason Katims?
I
Jason
think
Katims'
Adams.
previous work on Friday Night Lights.
Well, I think first of all, nothing beats the series Friday Night Lights.
That is
so,
correct.
yes.
Okay.
Both of these are, I will say to students, in all of your spare time, both of these are available on Netflix. So if you have a subscription to Netflix, all of Friday Night Lights is there. And actually, I think all of season 4 of Parenthood
Maybe
is
after
there.
online CWC is concluded in August, they should watch this.
Possibly. Yes. No, that's a good thing. But no series stacks up to Friday Night Lights for just the realism, I think, that it presents in terms of relationships and the characters. But Parenthood is a really good show. So I feel like, I don't know, as opposed to a homemade cookie, Parenthood is like the best bakery cookie that you can get. So I think the relationships that, again, are presented as kind of always a central part of the show. I feel like it's not quite as authentic as Friday Night Lights. It doesn't feel as authentic to me. I mean, I feel like on Friday Night Lights, these are people I can relate to. Parenthood, not as much. I mean, they still are kind of living in the glitz and glam of, even though it's not Hollywood, they're in Berkeley, California, and that seems like another world. But at the same time, it's a worthwhile watch.
So
I
is
think.
it more of a snickerdoodle or a ginger snap? I'm curious what kind of cookie Parenthood is.
I'm probably gonna have to go with snickerdoodle. I feel like as a bakery cookie, snickerdoodle is the one that can kind of stack up to a homemade chocolate chip. I've never been able to find a chocolate chip cookie that tastes as good as
Why would you buy a
homemade one.
chocolate chip cookie in a bakery?
These are good questions. That was one of Plato's first questions, actually. So he was thinking about it, and Aristotle was like, let's just go find one. Let's go to a bakery and find the best cookie we can. Start there. So, so anyway, happy birthday to Monica Potter. I remember that years ago she was in a film with Morgan Freeman. I can't remember the name of it now, but she played a She was like an FBI agent, and anyway, all right. But you can look for that, and if you find it, you can email it in. Happy anniversary to the Loonie.
The Loonie.
Yes, the Loonie. On this day in 1987, the Royal Canadian Mint introduced a $1 coin with a loon on it. Now, Chris, you're a native Minnesotan.
I am.
How do you feel about Canada stealing the loon?
I so deeply want to be aggrieved by this. I want to say, Canada, how many national symbols do you need?
I agree.
You've got the maple leaf. You've got, like, the Mountie, right? You've got hockey and lacrosse, basically, are yours. What else do you need? But I did some research last night, and it turns out, as best we can understand, Minnesota has about 12,000 loons, which is more than any other state but Canada. Canada has at least 250,000 loons. So I think we might need to cede our pride and let them have the loony on this.
Do you think they call them the doubloon instead of like doubloon? I was thinking pirate currency is now.
I'm wondering, is loony English and French?
Oh.
Or is it loony? Perhaps?
Yes.
That was a great bit. Happy trails to the United States men's national football team.
Yes.
I tried to make my voice lift because we're actually recording this on Wednesday, June 25th, a day before the U.S. soccer team plays Germany in their third match in the World Cup. So, Amy, since we're doing this ahead of time, give us a prediction. Did the U.S. make it into the round of 16?
No. Oh. Yeah, no, I would love to say yes, but we're talking about who we're up against here, so it's a little bit like putting a Ford up against a BMW. I don't think that
I think it's a lot like putting
it's a lot like it, yeah, and I don't think that it's going to happen. I actually am really proud of our USA team. I think we all were a little shocked that they came this far. So, but I think this is where she ends. So,
all right. Well, you can tell us if Amy is wrong.
Yeah,
because it's Monday.
You know what? I'll be happy to be wrong, but for the sake of making for the sake of predictions, I'm going to say no.
I'll be happy that.
Yeah.
Okay. Amy, do you want to talk about something called We've Got Your Back?
I do. So we're going to introduce kind of a new fun element to bring some just an element of whimsy, as we said in our last episode to the course, and we are going to call this We've Got Your Back Man. And you may have noticed, hopefully you've purchased it by now, your text is called The Cultures of the West, A History, and the author is Clifford Backman. So we thought that a fun thing to do would be that take a picture of wherever you happen to be reading your Backman. From reading your responses thus far, a lot of you are going to be in exotic locales like Hayward, Wisconsin, as well as in the Philippines, and we have a student who's in Huntington Beach in California, and so we thought it would be really fun to take a picture of wherever you happen to take your Backman, and we will go ahead and post those on Moodle, and at the end of our time together in 6 weeks, kind of see all of the places that our little Backman, not so little, but that our little Backman has gone. So, and I'm excited to see the places that I will also be reading.
So how can you share that with us?
So you can just go ahead and email it to us with a file, and we can go ahead and post those on Moodle for everybody to see. So
you can also email us with responses to this webisode. You do have to write a discussion post about just and unjust laws. You can find that on Moodle. But there might be other things we talked about that you want to weigh in on. Maybe you resonate. Maybe more of a Plato person or an Aristotle person. What do you think about how Sam and Amy ranked the most important ancients in the food chain, which, by the way, we'll definitely be doing again?
Do you know of a good place to get a bakery chocolate chip cookie? Share it with us.
And are you upset about the loon thing? I'm guessing no, but you never know.
And how are you handling the USA's loss?
In the second round, which I don't know if they would have played that game.
Yeah, well.
Sure, predicted multiple matches. So do all that, and you can mail it to your small group leader, and we might talk about that on our next webisode.
All right, until then.
Good night, Canada.
See you next time.